but it's
He was interested in scientific agriculture. Texas. Well, it must have been a year or two.
yeah.
And he makes a distinction that Odom later dealt with a great deal, that there was a middle class between the lower class.
I'm sorry,
redneck.
you say Olmsted makes it up.
Yeah. He made the distinction that you had a little fringe of these allegedly, professedly aristocratic planters, and then you had, of course, a bunch of poor farmers, really illiterate redneck types. But there was a substantial middle class in there, and many of whom had a few slaves, perhaps, and who were running the same kind of farms that being run in the Middle West. Some of them in areas where it wasn't particularly suitable. They weren't getting into cotton. They were raising hogs and meat and so forth for market. And most people, the stereotype of the South has always been that just the redneck and the aristocrat, nobody in between. And in fact, it was a middle class society. Certainly the urban place was middle class. I can't imagine I could have grown up in a more middle class community than the one I did.
You were talking about the difficulty of finding a place for the study.
This study finally resulted. We got the thing out, and the day before the Brown decision came down, the University of North Carolina Press, Chapel Hill, brought out the book. I had thought that my obligation would be to edit these reports finally for publication. Well, it turned out the time element was such that these scholars were never going to meet that kind of a deadline. That was a horrendous deadline. So I had to finally write the book. I put together what I took out of what and I wrote, and the book was then published under my name. And that's when the old politician in Arkansas asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm about to publish a book. He said, what's it called? I said, it's going to be called The Negro in the Schools. He said, son, you sound to me like you've got yourself in the position of a man running for son of a bitch without opposition. And I think I was elected by acclamation for a while there. I used to go back to Arkansas. You know, I had a standard line I like to use. I'd go back to Arkansas after been away about 20 years, and by that time I'd gotten cleaned up. You know, all this was behind us, and it was ancient history. And I'd be somewhere, and a blue-haired lady would come up to me at a cocktail party and say, oh, Mr. Ashmore, I've heard so much about you, and I'd always say, how would you like to hear the other side? So.
Okay, Jamie, let's... Harry,
Yeah.
I've just discovered that you and I are about the same age, except that you are 28 days.
That's right. I'm just a young sprout. You know George Stoney?
Oh, yes. Oh, very good. Bill Gordon.
Bill Gordon.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
He's of the Atlanta World family.
Oh, I remember that.
Remember that. Going back. Yeah.
I lived in Atlanta from 1946 to 1948.
Oh, to 1948.
Yeah. And I remember the Atlanta World at that time.
Oh, yes. I see. Yeah. Well, I came there in 1949, actually, and as the managing editor of the newspaper, and stayed there through 1958, before I went overseas on an international journalism fellowship, New York Herald Tribune, the Ogden Reed fellowship, which gave me an opportunity to travel extensively in Africa. And
When you got in the Foreign Service, didn't you?
Then I joined the Foreign Service, but that was just before I joined the Foreign Service. I got in the Foreign Service after I came back off that trip. I've seen about 25 African countries, including South Africa. Of all places. A wonderful experience.
Well, Harry, could you tell us a little bit about this gathering that's tonight?
Well, John Topham, of course, is a sort of a legendary figure in the South. He was the first New York Times Southern correspondent. He came down here in 1947. Well, I guess before that, I guess he came down about 46, right at the end of the war. I remember the first time I ever saw him, I was still in Charlotte. I was the editor of the Charlotte News. He came by to see me. He was just starting his rounds. And Pop didn't settle in Atlanta because he stayed in Chattanooga because the Times owned the Chattanooga
The
Times.
paper, yes. I remember
Oh,
that.
it's the other way around. The Chattanooga Times owned the
New York Times, the Oxes,
Yeah,
yes.
the family had started there, the
that's
Ox
right.
and Salzburgers and all that. So Pop worked out of Chattanooga, but he roamed the South, and he was here during the build-up, pre-Brown days, and then, of course, through the whole, much of the whole early days of the Civil Rights troubles. And then he was replaced by Claude Sitton, who will be here. And Claude was really a remarkable reporter. He was at first a one-man band. Pop then went to Chattanooga and became the managing editor of the Times property there. But when Pop was roaming the South, he spent a lot of time with the academics. He got to know a lot of the people in the universities. He was going to give the sociological background for all this, plus knowing all of the rednecks and politicians and governors and God knows what all, the black leaders, Martin Luther King. And he got to know just a wide variety of people. So some years back, John Griffin, whose house we're at here, John was a professor at Emory when I first met him, and he worked on this Ashmore project, as they called it, this Negro in the Schools book. He was with the group that operated here, and John later went down to Florida State. He lived in Tallahassee, and after, well, all this got going, he got intrigued with getting some people down to reminisce about these early days of the movement. And so I think one of the first meetings was down there. He had a little house out in the country. And Ralph McGill was there, and Popham, and Bill Baggs, who was a dear friend of mine, who was the editor of the Miami News. And I've forgotten who else. But anyway, John has been, ever since, assembling this group.
Oh, so it's Griffith who's behind it all.
Well, Griffin is sort of he's the dead mother.
I
He's the
see.
mother of Paul. And so about once a year, we tend to get together. And later, this got mixed up with what is now called the Popham Seminar. And that's an annual meeting which involves the journalists that live through this, and editors and the people who report this, and also some of these academics that Pop knew. So it's sort of a joint meeting, and they meet here in Atlanta. Well, they met various places, but now it always turns out to be Atlanta. And they meet on a Saturday, like today, and have a dinner, and sort of a lot of drinking bout and lying, it's like an old soldiers reunion. Everybody's heard all the stories 15 times, and the academics will be there. And then there'll be the session tomorrow morning and wake up around noon. So they do it out at the airport. People can fly in, and they do it on the weekends. So it's become a kind of an institution. Everybody's getting awfully long in the tooth. Best writers in the South these days, he lives in Nashville. And Roy Reed is here. Roy was with Pop on the New York Times. He was reporting backward the troubles. And he's now a journalism professor at the University of Arkansas. He worked for me on the Gazette. I hired him when he first started out. At the time. He's here. And Claude Sitton, who was Pop's successor as the principal correspondent, later went to New York as the national affairs editor of the New York Times, then came back south, which he wanted to do as the editor of the Raleigh News Journal in New Washington a couple of years ago when he retired. And he's now teaching part-time at Emory and living in Atlanta. Oh, he'll be here. He's good. And, I think then some other people, Tom Teefin, who's a former editor of the Constitution, is now on Talk News. I think he'll be there. And a variety of people that time. I think we've got about 50 people on the news. And I came over here Thursday because it takes me all day to get here.
I know.
California, it's a long haul. And so I couldn't get here until Thursday night, and I wanted to spend yesterday with John, see some other people. And then Popham came over yesterday afternoon, and from Edgerton, I think, showed up. So that's the kind of, and then we came in
Last night.
and you knew some fun.
Well, one of the things that this project I'm working on now about the textile organization, it's reminded me of my own class attitudes,
That's right.
which I was almost completely unaware of until I got involved in this. I grew up in Winston-Salem,
Right.
which was
We were
mainly
very
a
much-
tobacco town, but also had its cotton
That's right.
mills. And I didn't realize until I got into this how my own middle class attitudes
that's true.
about the lint heads
That's
was. So, it's surprising when I go into a mill village. I'm still surprised at how literate those people are. I mean, it's shocking to
That's
see
right.
how those old prejudices limit one's anticipation.
There's no question about it. Even the ones that are old enough to go back to the previous generation, most of them were illiterate, but they were frequently great storytellers. You know, that was a rural art, blacks and whites too. You talk to anybody back there really in the country, and they can tell you, and they illustrate this as wonderfully eloquent stuff that you find. It doesn't really have a lot to do with reading and writing. It's an art. It's an oral. It's what John Edgerton calls porch talk. People sat down before there was any television. People sat out in the hot weather on the porch and they told stories back and forth, lies or people about their relatives and all these crazy people that live down the road. And so you get this, and I think this is this is one of the issues now. We get on all this PC business, which seems to me to be far out of hand. But there is a common Southern culture that I think embraces blacks as well as whites. Now you've had all the division, you had all the, but they shared history, and history is a great hell of a big part of this. And that nothing like this happened anywhere else in the country. The blacks and whites have no common history, and they got a hell of a lot of hostility, much more so than you get here. Not that it isn't still here, and what you're saying is latent class attitude. I'm sure even those of us who work to try to get rid of it, we still have it to some degree. I mean, you're just automatic. You don't. And of course, I think once you become conscious of it, you overcome it. But I'm not sure that it isn't somehow deeply ingrained.
I find I always have to recognize
Right.
that it might be there.
Right.
Just as the same thing with race.
That's right. I think it is. I think it works on both sides. Now, if you have a long enough association, there'll be situations where both sides overcome it. But if a couple of strangers meeting, black and white, there's bound to be. I mean, they don't know how you're going to react, and you don't know exactly how they're going to react. I mean, that's not overdoing it, which is offensive. And so that's a natural problem.
I
believe-
once remember being in a public meeting where there was some debate over a film I had made with some black people in it.
Yeah.
And somebody from the audience says, "Oh, but George, you're not prejudiced."
Yeah.
And I said, "Wait a minute, wait a minute. I'm working at it."
That's right.
But don't trust me, because it's there. And I think the
Well,
same thing
one of the-
probably with
I think
the
it
lint
is.
heads.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I've concluded a long time ago, I've written a lot about this, that first of all, the distinction between desegregation and integration was critically important. Integration is a personal acceptance at a level that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the law. It has a lot to do with living together. But your desegregation was to get rid of the barriers, knock them down, and we've been able to do that. And I always figured it's going to take another generation of experience of people living together, working together, particularly on a co-equal basis, for this to begin to overcome on both sides. I think this is, you can't speed this up, and there's a lot of nonsense being written about this now. Hacker's just got a book out about how he suddenly discovered that he has some race prejudice. I don't know what the hell, I don't know where the hell he's been all these years. It's a very shock book, talks about we got to face this. He said, well, hell, I think one of the most revealing experiences, and again, this Truman's Monument, the desegregation of the military, which for the first real institutional desegregation, and these people had to fight and live together, and they were in an artificial situation to begin with. In the first place, where no women were around in those days, and so you didn't get into all that complication. And it turned out, I went up served 2 weeks active duty at Camp Chaffee during the Korean War when it just started. And these redneck kids were coming in from Mississippi and Alabama and New Orleans, Louisiana, along with these blacks who were coming in, and they came right from reception center. This was a basic artillery trench. And all of a sudden they were dumped into a situation they'd never been in their lives. The guy next to him in the shower was black. And the guy eating next to him was black. And the black was in the same thing. He's a redneck next to him in the shower. And then the military by that time had integrated to the point where most of the sergeants were black. And here these redneck kids were not only taking orders from a black, but they were getting their ass eaten out by a black. Well, I walked around, nobody knew what to do with me when I was up there, and looked at this at close range and then talked to a lot of these old white officers and accepted it, and some of them were still as racist as they'd ever been, but they all agreed that if you're gonna have them, this is the only way to do it. You know, it's
If you're gonna have them.
That's right. If you gotta have them, it's segregated. And so it worked, and it's worked since. And you see the final flowering of it, and here we got a black commanding general, a hell of a fellow, Colin Powell. And I've always said Colin Powell is the living symbol of why you need affirmative action. He couldn't have been there without affirmative action. Furthermore, he had to demonstrate courage and capacity, organizing ability, all these things that the black stereotypes supposed not to have. He had to demonstrate them in spades because he had to overcome all of this prejudice which was there, and he made it. And I think that says a lot about what this experience is going to do if we don't turn it back, which is, for God's sake, is what, of course, the Bush is trying to do.
Now, I'm running into this kind of contradiction. For a part of this project, I travel with a friend from Gladys, and we would go into these cotton mill villages, and I found them inviting him to eat, and all of this in a way that I'd never expected. Right. But as soon as I started talking about unions, some of these same people would be, "You're a very nice man, but I've got a granddaughter in that mill, and it will be held against her." So that I find that this kind of economic fear seems to be quite as strong or stronger than the racial fear. Well, do you think we'll ever get over that?
I don't know, and I was surprised that you mentioned this. I hadn't really thought about that. Is there that much actual, is this a perceived threat or is it a real threat? I mean, is it that kind of retribution, or can they still do that? Can they just fire somebody out of hand because they're leaning toward the union?
That's what happened, for example, in Kannapolis this summer.
Well,
we followed that campaign, and you'll find it in the videotape that I sent you. And there was selective, right after the campaign, there was selective firing.
Well,
this is a tactic which I'm afraid is just accepted.
Well, I think, don't you think that's retrograde? Don't you think there was a period there where people could assume the union had enough strength to protect them? And I think now the unions are getting weaker, and of course the damn government is against them now. The government's doing everything, the Republicans are doing everything they can to weaken the unions. And the unions, again, their strength is being sapped by the fact that their own success is doing it. They bring all these former blue-collar workers are now all middle class and conservative and anti-union, which is true. I mean, this comes into it. Again, I hadn't realized that. I was surprised that you talk about the fact that this history of Gastonia and this period has been virtually eliminated from people's consciousness. I realized that was a fact, but I thought that was just a part of our collective absence of memory, which I think the media contributes to, particularly television, where everything just happened today. I mean, yesterday doesn't exist. But you seem to think it's really a conscious thing, that these people are frightened. They don't want to talk about it, and they open up when you come in and give them a chance to. The ones, particularly the old ones.
The interesting, how'd you get my name?
Yeah.
your family was blacklisted. No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
And then we show them their names from a list we got out of the archives in Washington, where there was a protest, and their father or their grandfather was in that thing. And then it opens up, and they start crying. Yes, we did have to leave town, and my mother ran a boarding house for the railroad workers for 6 years, and we finally got back in 1940 when they needed us, and we've worked here ever since. But no,
They don't want to talk about it.
that's right. And until we,
Yeah,
then
right.
it begin to open up when we have their name
Right.
on a document.
Yeah.
It's very touching. It's
That's-
almost like going to somebody denying that there were ever a slave on a plantation until you find them listed listed as
That's right.
on a bill of sale.
Yeah.
Well, have you run across, what's the record of the FBI in this? Have you seen much of that? Were
We
they-
haven't looked into that. That would be an interesting
Well, that's
thing.
curious. I had just thought
Yeah,
of it. I
that's
don't
an
know. I don't
interesting
have any. My memory doesn't suggest that they had any particularly active role, but I expect they damn well did.
They could have.
Old
yes.
J. Edgar Hoover, certainly in the later stages, you know,
Yes.
he must have.
Yes.
He must have had them
Yes.
in there.
But you must have a very similar kind of parallel between the middle class blacks who
Yeah.
were very much supported by the world
Yeah.
and a group of blacks who were not not so established.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a conflict there. And people get the feeling that blacks who've been able to get out of the ghetto and get into the suburbs, so to speak, and get into top positions, feel that we left these people behind. And then that gives them a feeling that, sure you have. So you're in just as much danger as a white person.
That's right.
In many cases, more so, because you have betrayed us. See.
Right.
That story hadn't got across again. I guess that also happens among the whites. But you speak here more class and the feeling that feeling between whites and the so-called classism and the race problem on the other hand. My feeling is that, well, maybe I should back up a bit here. You mentioned also something about the black checking the list and finding that he's not on the slave, but I think that's changing now.
Yeah, I think that's so. I think
that's
they're
changing.
raising consciousness now.
The fascinating thing to me, going into these local archives and the local museums,
Yeah.
almost no Southern archive or museum now will avoid having black history.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Many of them are doing a good job of it.
That's right.
There's almost no working class white history.
Well,
That's coming.
That's right.
Coming.
And one of the things we're doing with this film is to help fill that gap.
Yeah.
Well, I just did a story a couple of years ago on this woman in North Carolina. I don't know if you know about that story now. Somerset homecoming. Well, there's a black woman.
Oh,
who,
yeah.
You know about
Yeah,
that?
yeah, mhm.
Well, I went down and interviewed her and did a story for the Colonial Williamsburg magazine. And what was brought out there, she was tracing her history back to the time when people were slaves on that plantation. And each year now, she invites former slave owners and former, I mean, members of the former slave owners and descendants of former slaves to come together.
Right.
And she has got them to come together, hundreds of them come down. That's right.
Big annual event.
Big annual event every day. I mean, every year on the I think it's on Labor Day. She invites them,
Right.
and she's got a great story there.
I
Well,
think
now,
it
it's
was.
interesting that we went back to a parallel thing.
Yeah.
We went back to East Noonan, Georgia,
Yeah.
where they have an annual get-together of all the people who worked in the East Noonan cotton mill.
Right.
And we were there to interview them about what happened in the 30s. We showed some of our material. We showed the footage of the newsreel footage of the thing. We were able to present to one of the families letters which their father wrote to Roosevelt at the time and wrote to Talmadge at the time. All seemed to be well. They started talking about things that were happening, that happened in 34.
Right.
And then until one gentleman got up and he said, "We want to make sure that this is not of a conspiracy for unions." And suddenly you just felt a tightening all over that group. And people were uncomfortable about talking just like that.
Just like that. well, I don't know if you saw the story or not, but about 3 weeks ago, a group of blacks had a reunion
I'm just moving out of the
at,
song a little bit more.
down in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson, home of Thomas Jefferson. And they were there, they said, because they wanted to trace their history back to our homes. See? So they call it homecoming. Now, this was on the news and in the press and everything. So, but there is a feeling now, among blacks in particular, that they don't mind tracing their history back to this particular point, their roots back. And in North Carolina, for an example, this was told me by a young white fella. He said that there's a group that belonged to a fireman's union or something, and they all get together once a year for a big party, and the blacks and whites, and they all calling each other cousin this and cousin that. Cousin this.
Right. Well, I think I quoted that for Dixie. When I first started working on the paper, the Ashmores in Greenville County had been there since the first trees were cut down, and they were kin to everybody. I met them, all kinds of Ashmores, except I never met a rich one, unfortunately. They were big in politics, and my cousin John Ashmore was the county supervisor, and cousin Bob Ashmore was the prosecuting attorney, and cousin Morris Ashmore was the tax collector. So we had it pretty well, and I was covering the courthouse, so we had it pretty well locked up. So I asked old John Ashmore, who was the patriarch of the family, who was the county supervisor, I was sitting in his office one day, and I said, "God damn, John, I just can't figure." I said, "We got all kind of kin folks. Who are we kin to in this county?" He said, "Son, the way I look at it, we're kin to everybody in this county, black or white, one way or another." I've always thought that was a real definitive statement about an old.
Okay, all right, John. Okay, John, come on here.
I don't think he's got any sound on it.
John, great to see you.
Oh, John,
How'd you do?
I'm doing all right. And you?
Good. My cousin.
Glad to see
Oh,
Bill.
your cousin, yeah. Oh, yes, I'm glad to see you,
Oh,
too.
so what Harry's just telling that story about being kin to everybody?
We got into that.
Oh,
We
sure.
talked about the kin folks.
Oh, yeah, no question.
We were just talking about the heritage
Yeah.
that we when we were doing a reunion of the mill workers in East Newnan, Georgia. They had for 26 years they've been getting together.
Yeah.
And so we were showing some of this material and talking about the 34th strike, and all seemed to be well until one gentleman got up and said, "How do we know this isn't part of a conspiracy for the unions?" And suddenly there was a pall over the place. You just felt the tightening of everybody. And it was a very uncomfortable time there. Until somebody said, "Well, all of that's behind us. We want to forget it all. We were just all one family, and it was all love." And so, if you
tells you the feeling's still there.
if you can cover up something in the back and grass it over, then it's all right.
Well, George has got me going back over a lot of stuff I haven't thought of in a very long time. You know, the class attitudes.
And speaking of your relatives, there is an Ashmore who in the Charlotte papers was identified as somebody who was heading a vigilante group during the strike.
Wouldn't be surprised.
I will send
We
you.
had all kinds.
I will send you that. I will send you a Xerox of that.
That's great.
I don't think we had any leaders of the NAACP, but I'm sure we had some on the other side.
Not Du Bois. You found it.
I'm about out here, Dad. You want me
Okay.
to reload?
No, we're fine.
Chance to chat a little bit.
Known for the walk-around sequence.